The desert gives nothing for free. By the summer of 1942, the North African sun had turned the landscape into a furnace, an endless sea of heat and dust, where engines burned, tires melted, and men aged in weeks. Here, between the endless dunes and jagged cliffs of Libya, the German Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was fighting for its life. Rommel, the Desert Fox, had become a legend. His blitzkrieg tactics had outsmarted and outmaneuvered the British at every turn. But now, that legend stood on the edge of collapse. The problem was not the enemy. It was fuel. Every tank, every truck, every airplane in Rommel's army ran on gasoline, and every drop of that fuel had to cross the Mediterranean, dodging British submarines and aircraft before being trucked hundreds of miles across the desert. Then, on a night in early June 1942, the impossible happened. A squadron of Allied bombers, flying low from Egypt, struck Rommel's main fuel depot near Tobruk. Explosions lit the desert like day. In a matter of minutes, the Afrika Korps lost nearly all its fuel reserves. Flames devoured thousands of barrels of precious gasoline. By dawn, the smoke hung heavy in the sky, black and oily, a funeral pyre for Rommel's dreams of pushing into Egypt. The next morning, engines coughed and died. Convoys stopped. Tanks sat motionless. Even Rommel's own command car ran dry. For the first time in the Desert War, the Afrika Korps was stranded. Panic spread through the ranks. Men gathered around empty fuel drums, staring at them as though they might magically refill. Officers argued over what little remained. Rommel himself stood by his staff car, his binoculars fixed eastward toward the British lines. He knew the enemy would not wait long. If the British Eighth Army realized the Afrika Korps had no fuel, they would strike, and this time there would be no retreat. In the field maintenance depot outside Tobruk, 24-year-old mechanic Hans Schaefer sat beside a burnt-out truck, his uniform streaked with oil and sand. He had been awake for 2 days, helping recover vehicles damaged in the raid. Around him lay wreckage, twisted pipelines, shattered barrels, and the charred remains of fuel trucks. To most men, it looked hopeless. But Schaefer was not most men. Born in Hamburg, trained as a machinist before the war, he had an unusual mind, one that saw machines not as finished objects, but as possibilities. When others saw junk, he saw parts. And as the desert wind carried the stench of burning fuel across the camp, Schaefer made a decision that would change the course of the campaign. He would find a way, any way, to make fuel again. Schaefer's idea was born from desperation and memory. Months earlier, he had repaired a captured British fuel truck fitted with a small portable distillation unit, a crude refinery designed to extract usable gasoline from low-grade oil. It was slow, inefficient, and barely functional, but it had worked. If he could build something similar, larger, stronger, and faster, maybe he could squeeze a few more days of fuel out of whatever scraps remained. The first step was finding raw material. With permission from his commanding officer, Schaefer and a handful of mechanics began scouring the wreckage field. They found cracked steel drums, broken condensers, and fragments of copper tubing. From a bombed-out British truck, they recovered the remains of an oil separator and a bent heat exchanger. Under the desert sun, they dragged the pieces back to the depot, laying them out like puzzle fragments. Schaefer drew rough sketches in the sand, pipes here, filters there, a condenser loop made from scavenged tubing. He explained his plan to the others. They would build a makeshift refinery, a series of improvised distillation columns heated by burning diesel and lubricants. The system would separate usable fuel from contaminated oil and wreckage residue. It wouldn't be pure, and it might destroy engines eventually, but it would run them for now. The other mechanics stared at him, skeptical but willing. They had nothing else to lose. Rommel's army was dying in silence. For 3 days, the men worked without rest. They built furnaces from steel drums, sealing them with mud and soap to stop leaks. Old exhaust pipes became condensers. Truck radiators became cooling grids. They even used the curved fenders of wrecked tanks to form collection troughs. By day, the desert was an oven. By night, it froze. Each morning, Allied reconnaissance planes droned overhead, searching for signs of German movement. Schaefer's team hid their work under camouflage nets and piles of sand. The first trial was a disaster. When they lit the furnace, the heat cracked one of the pipes, spraying hot oil across the camp. The men dove for cover as the whole unit nearly exploded. But Schaefer didn't stop. He adjusted the pressure valves, re-welded the joints, and scavenged more tubing from abandoned vehicles. On the third attempt, something extraordinary happened. As the furnace roared, a thin stream of golden liquid began dripping from the condenser coil. Gasoline. Not perfect, not refined, but flammable. The men cheered. Schaefer dipped a rag in the liquid, struck a match, and watched it burst into blue flame. It worked. For the first time since the bombing, the smell of fuel filled the air. When word reached headquarters that a mechanic had somehow built a refinery out of scrap, Rommel refused to believe it, at first. But after a staff officer confirmed the story, Rommel himself drove out to the depot, accompanied by a small escort. The men snapped to attention as the Desert Fox stepped from his half-track, his eyes scanning the strange contraption. Smoke and steam hissed from pipes. The furnace glowed red-hot. Schaefer saluted, covered in grease and soot. Rommel studied him for a long moment, then asked simply, "How much fuel can you make?" Schaefer hesitated. "Enough to move a few tanks, maybe enough to hold the line." Rommel smiled faintly. "Then that's enough." He ordered Schaefer's refinery protected at all costs. Within hours, trucks began lining up with barrels and containers. The refinery operated day and night, pouring out crude but usable fuel. Mechanics filtered it through sand and cloth. Tank engines sputtered, coughed, and came back to life. Across the front, Rommel's men heard the rumor, "The fuel is flowing again." Hope returned to the Afrika Korps. For 5 days, Schaefer's makeshift refinery worked around the clock. The fumes were unbearable. The heat could melt boots. But each gallon mattered. Rommel used the fuel with surgical precision. Not for retreat, but for maneuver. Small armored groups struck at British forward patrols, creating the illusion of full strength. Convoys moved at night, spreading dust to confuse reconnaissance. The British, cautious after previous ambushes, hesitated. They did not know the Germans were running on fumes. Literally. The extra days bought by Schaefer's innovation allowed Rommel to reposition his units near Mersa Matruh, consolidating defenses before the next British push. From the air, Allied pilots reported increased German activity, but the truth was more incredible. The entire army was running on fuel born from junk and desperation. By the time British intelligence realized the truth, the moment had passed. The counteroffensive was delayed, and in war, time can be more valuable than victory itself. By late 1942, Rommel's luck, and Schaefer's miracle, could no longer hold. The Allies, supplied from secure ports and airfields, gained overwhelming superiority. At El Alamein, Montgomery's Eighth Army broke through German lines, pushing the Afrika Korps westward into Tunisia. The desert swallowed everything. Schaefer's refinery was abandoned, its pipes twisted by heat, its drums half buried in sand. But those who had seen it never forgot. Even as the Afrika Korps retreated, word spread through the ranks about the boy mechanic who had saved them. Rommel himself reportedly mentioned Schaefer in his dispatches, not by name, but as a young genius of the desert workshops. When the campaign finally ended in 1943, with the surrender in Tunisia, Schaefer was among the thousands taken prisoner. He survived the war, later working as an engineer in West Germany. He never spoke much about those days, only that necessity makes men inventors. War is often remembered for its generals and battles, for grand strategies and sweeping movements. But sometimes, history turns on smaller things, on courage, on creativity, on one man refusing to accept defeat. Hans Schaefer's improvised refinery did not win the North African campaign, but it saved it, for a moment, long enough for thousands of men to escape annihilation, long enough for history to record the extraordinary power of human ingenuity. In the endless desert, where even machines seemed to die of thirst, a single mechanic proved that innovation could be as powerful as any weapon. When Rommel later wrote his memoirs, he reflected on that summer of 1942. He never mentioned Schaefer by name, but his words spoke of him all the same. In war, salvation often comes not from the generals, but from those who refuse to let the engine stop. And somewhere, beneath the sands of Libya, the rusted remains of Hans Schaefer's impossible refinery may still lie, a forgotten monument to the night the desert itself was forced to yield.